This video program has been produced to demonstrate the maintenance procedures for the 6D22T diesel engine, which is mounted on excavators, cranes, generators, and similar equipment. The procedures here will be shown in the same sequence that they appear in the shop manual for the engine. Maintenance and inspection work on engines are essential for keeping them in a safe and reliable operating condition. Even a small mistake may trigger a major accident or problem. This program will demonstrate actual disassembly and reassembly work for a 6D22T engine using an experienced technician so that service personnel will be able to grasp the whole process of operations. Service personnel should view this program several times and acquaint themselves with the procedures and processes involved. The actual disassembly and reassembly work, however, must be carried out correctly by referring to the shop manual. Before beginning, a variety of special tools must be prepared and checked. Now let's start the disassembly of the engine in the prescribed sequence. Before starting, check to see that the cooling water and engine oil have been completely drained. Disassembly begins with the removal of the cooling fan. It can be removed by unscrewing the bolts using a wrench. Remove the fuel filter. Then, remove the inlet manifold by unscrewing the bolts which fasten it to the engine. Next, dismount the turbocharger from the engine. Remove the exhaust manifold from the engine. Then remove the clamps and the injection pipes. Disengage and remove the water pipe. To dismount the alternator, first loosen the bolts, then remove the V-belts, and finally the alternator. Loosen the tension pulley and remove the V-belts for the water pump before removing the pump itself. Remove the crankshaft pulley. Remove the injection pipes. Then, dismount the fuel injection pump from the engine by unscrewing the bolts on the coupling. Disjoin and remove the fuel leak-off pipe. Then, remove the fuel injection nozzles. Do not place the cylinder head on a workbench while the fuel injection nozzles are still in place, because the nozzle tips protruding from the cylinder head could be damaged. Start removing the cylinder head and nozzle mechanism by removing the rocker cover. Before unscrewing the bolts, loosen the adjusting screws on the rocker arms, which are being held up by the push rods. By removing the bolts, you can remove the assembly of the rocker arm, rocker shaft, and bracket. You must remove this assembly, lifting it straight upward because it is secured in position by spring pins. Remove the push rods and valve caps. Remove the cylinder head assembly by unscrewing the bolts. You must remove it by lifting it straight upward, since it is positioned onto the crankcase by locator pins. Due care must be paid in removing the cylinder head gasket so as to not damage the surface of the cylinder head and the crankcase. Use a special tool called a valve lifter to remove the valve cotters while compressing the valve springs evenly and without offsetting them. Remove the valves. Then, remove the nozzle tubes in this manner using a special tool called a nozzle tube remover. Replace the nozzle tubes and O-rings and do not reuse them. Remove the side cover. Remove the tappets. Remove the oil filter. Then the injection pump drive case. Dismount the starter motor. Before removing the flywheel, first remove the pointer fitted to the flywheel housing. The flywheel itself can be removed by screwing bolts into the extraction holes. Screw bolts into another set of extraction holes to remove the rear oil seal retainer. Remove the flywheel housing by unscrewing the 6 bolts which fasten it to the rear plate. Measure the protrusion of the piston and the backlash of the timing gear before disassembling the main moving parts of the crankcase. Place a dial gauge on the upper surface of the crankcase and set it to 0. Then place the gauge on the upper end of the piston and locate the top dead center. The reading of the gauge at this instant is the protrusion of the piston. If the protrusion exceeds the standard, check the clearance in the connecting rod and around the piston. Measure the backlash of the timing gears. For proper evaluation, the measurement of backlash must be made at 3 or more positions for a pair of gears. If a backlash exceeds the limit, check the bushing for the idler gear and each other gear and replace them if necessary. Measure the end play of the camshaft. If it exceeds the limit, replace the thrust plate. Remove the oil pan. Then remove the front cover. Remove the oil pump and oil strainer. Remove the camshaft. Measure the end play of the connecting rods. If it exceeds the limit, replace the rod concerned. Measure the end play of the crankshaft. If it exceeds the limit, replace the thrust plate. Remove the idler gear. Scrape off the carbon deposited on the upper portion of the cylinder liners. Loosen the bearing caps on the connecting rods. Take the piston out of the cylinder liners. Remove the main bearing caps. Unload the crankshaft from the crankcase. Measure the protrusion of the cylinder liners while the liners are held by bolts. If the protrusions exceed the standard, replace either the cylinder liner concerned or the crankcase. Before the cylinder liners are removed, be sure to write locating marks on them and the crankcase. Use a special tool called a cylinder liner extractor to remove the liners. Remove the piston rings using a special tool called a piston ring tool. Separate the piston and the connecting rod. Remove the rocker arm from its bracket. Prepare the micrometer, cylinder gauge, calipers, thickness gauges, and other required instruments. Before measuring and inspecting the disassembled parts, clean them using light oil. Evaluation of the measurements must be done according to the maintenance standards in the shop manual. Set each push rod on a V-block and use a dial gauge to measure the center while rotating the rod. If the center offset exceeds the limit, replace the rod concerned. Place the straight edge on the lower surface of the cylinder head and measure the distortion using thickness gauges. If distortion exceeds the limit, the surface must be corrected by a surface grinder. However, if the height between the upper and lower surfaces becomes less than the limit, replace the cylinder head. Measure the outer diameter of the valve stems. If it is smaller than the limit or worn eccentrically to a significant degree, replace the valve stem concerned. Measure the inner diameter of the valve guides using a dial gauge at two separate positions. If the clearance between the outer diameter of the valve stems and valve guides is larger than the limit, replace the guide concerned. To replace the valve guide, use a special tool called a valve guide puller. Removal of the guide must be done from the lower side of the cylinder head, and a new guide must be inserted so that the stopper on the valve guide makes complete contact with the cylinder head. Coat the contact surface of the valve seat insert with marker paint. Then attach a special tool called a valve lapper onto the valve and insert the valve into the valve guide with one firm push. Be sure not to turn the valve as you are inserting it. If the marker paint indicates the valve is not fitting evenly, follow the procedures in the shop manual to make the fitting perfectly even. Measure the tappet outer diameter and tappet guide inner diameter. If the clearance between them exceeds specifications, the tappet must be replaced. Set a dial gauge on the number 4 journal of the camshaft and measure the bend of the shaft by rotating the shaft around. The actual bend is equivalent to 1/2 of the indicated measurement. Measure the base circle diameter and the lobe height of the cam. If their difference is larger than the limit, the camshaft must be replaced. Measure the diameter of the camshaft journals and the inner diameter of the camshaft bushings. If they are larger than the limit, the bushing concerned must be replaced. Measure the inner diameter of the cylinder liners. If it is larger than the limit, the liner concerned must be either replaced or bored to an oversize. The boring must be done according to the instructions given in the shop manual. Measure the clearance between the piston grooves and the piston rings all around the periphery after carbon deposited on them has been cleanly removed. If the clearance exceeds the limit, replace either the piston ring or the piston concerned. Replacement of the piston rings must be done in sets. Use a micrometer to measure the outer diameter of the pistons. Since the outer wall of the piston is tapered, the measurement must be done at the position indicated in the shop manual. If the diameter is smaller than the limit, replace the piston concerned. Using the piston, insert the piston rings into the cylinder liner. Use a thickness gauge to measure the ring gap. If the gap exceeds the limit, replace that entire set of piston rings. Measure the span of the connecting rod bearing and the main bearing while holding them freely. If the span is smaller than the limit, replace the upper and lower bearings concerned. Measure the outer diameters of the crankshaft pins and the journals and the inner diameter of the connecting rod bearings and the main bearings. If the clearance exceeds the limit, replace the upper and lower bearings concerned. If there is a flaw or signs of seizure on the pins and the journals of the crankshaft, machine that portion to an undersize according to the instructions in the shop manual. Measure the bend of the crankshaft center journal. If the bend exceeds the limit, either machine it to an undersize or replace it. Measure the strain on the upper surface of the crankcase. If it is larger than the limit, correct it by machining. Heat the thermostat gradually in water to measure the valve opening temperature. The standard valve opening temperature is plus or minus 2 degrees centigrade of the temperature indicated on the thermostat. Keep the temperature constant for 5 minutes and check to see that the valve stays open during that time. Next, raise the temperature further until the bypass valve lifts. Then, keep it constant for another 5 minutes and measure the amount of the lift of the bypass valve. Now, lower the temperature to below 65 degrees and check to see that the valve fully closes. If the thermostat malfunctions during any of these inspections, it must be replaced. Disassemble the fuel injection nozzles by firmly holding each one in a vise and removing the cap nut, loosening the injection pressure adjusting nut, and removing the retaining nut and nozzle tip. Then, clean these parts by immersing them into light oil. Pull off the needle valve and use a wooden scraper to scrape off carbon deposited on the tip of the nozzle. Remove the carbon deposited in the fuel injection hole with a cleaning needle. Finally, clean the nozzle. Check to see if the needle valve cleaned in the light oil moves smoothly or not by inserting it into the nozzle. Then, while holding it vertically, draw the valve out about 1/3 of its full length from the nozzle and release it to check to see if it falls back into the nozzle by its own weight. If it does not, replace the nozzle. Assemble the nozzle again and check the fuel injection condition by adjusting the injection pressure to the specified level. If fuel injection appears bad, as shown here, replace the nozzle tip. We will now demonstrate the reassembly work. Before starting, remove the gaskets and seals from the parts disassembled and clean them in light oil. To reassemble the nozzle tube, first apply sealant to the new nozzle tube and then insert it into the cylinder head. Install it into the cylinder head by lightly hammering in a special tool called a nozzle tube installer flange. Next, apply engine oil to a special tool called a nozzle tube stamp and insert it into the nozzle tube. Then set the nozzle tube installer on the cylinder head and screw in the center bolt until the nozzle tube stamp slips out from the bottom of the cylinder head. Finally, perform a water leak test on the cylinder head after installing the nozzle tube. Apply engine oil to the lip of the valve stem seal and fit it onto the cylinder head by lightly hammering on a valve stem seal installer until the seal rests firmly on the cylinder head. After it is set into position, check the valve stem seal for any deformation or damage. Set the valve cotter into position by fitting on the 2 valve springs and depressing the outer spring uniformly and without offsetting it to either side. The tightly wound portion of the inner valve spring must be placed on the cylinder head side. Before installing the cylinder liners, fit on the new rubber packing and the O-rings. Apply soap water for lubrication to the crankcase and the exterior of the cylinder liner. Using a cylinder liner installer, set the brim portion of the cylinder liner securely into the crankcase by hammering lightly on the installer. Make sure the rubber packing and O-rings do not twist. When replacing the cylinder liner, use a liner which displays the same size mark as the piston. When installing the disassembled cylinder liner, make sure the mating mark provided on it before disassembly aligns to the corresponding mark on the crankcase. After the cylinder head has been temporarily reassembled to the crankcase, conduct a water leak test using a water pressure pump. To install the main bearings, first install the upper bearing, the one with an oil groove, and then the lower bearing, making sure the lug holes align with those on the crankcase. Attach only the thrust plate to the main bearing in the rearmost position. The side without the oil groove is placed toward the crankcase. Mount the crankshaft into the crankcase while suspending it horizontally as shown here. To install the main bearing caps, first lightly hammer the dowel pins into place. Attach each bearing to a corresponding main bearing cap in such a way that the bearing lug correctly fits to the lug groove on the cap. Attach the thrust plates to both sides of the rearmost main bearing with the grooveless sides facing toward the cap. Attach the main bearings in sequential order by placing them in a way that the lug groove on the bearing cap matches the lug groove on the crankcase. Tighten the bolts with the specified torque. Check the crankshaft to see that it turns freely with a light touch of the hand. Also check to see if the end play keeps within the standard. Attach the rear plate gaskets and rear plate into place by aligning the holes to the locator pins. After applying engine oil to each journal, insert the camshaft so that the mating mark on the camshaft gear aligns with a mark on the idler gear. Secure the thrust plate by tightening the two bolts with the specified torque. Install idler gear C so that the mating marks align with the one on idler gear A. Install the piston with the connecting rod so that the front mark on the piston and the lug groove on the connecting rod align in the same direction. When fitting on the piston rings, make sure the manufacturer's markings face upward. Use the piston ring tool to put the oil ring on first, followed by the second compression ring, then the first compression ring. Each ring must be positioned as shown here. Before installing the pistons, apply engine oil to the piston rings and the cylinder liners. With the assistance of two special tools known as a piston guide clamp and a piston guide lever, install each piston into the liner so that the front marks face the front of the engine. Attach the connecting rod cap while aligning the mating mark on it and the lug groove mark together and tightening the bolts with the specified torque. Check the degree of end play and piston protrusion. Now, install the oil pump and then the oil strainer. Temporarily attach the oil pan. Install the fuel injection pump drive case by aligning the mating marks and tightening the bolts temporarily. Install the flywheel housing and gasket by aligning the holes to the locator pins. Install the rear oil seal after first applying engine oil to the sliding portion. Install the flywheel by aligning its locator holes to the locator pins on the crankshaft. Tighten the bolts with the specified torque after first applying engine oil to them. Position number 1 or number 6 piston at top dead center and install a pointer. Then turn the flywheel until the number 16 aligns with the pointer. After applying engine oil, insert the tappets. Then fit on the side cover. Install the cylinder head by first putting the cylinder head gasket on the crankcase with its marks facing upward. Then align the cylinder head to the locator pins on the crankcase with the marks on the cylinder head bracket facing upward. Attach the push rods and the valve caps. Install the rocker shaft bracket by aligning it to the spring pin on the cylinder head. Tighten the cylinder head bolts in this sequence with a wet torque of 18 kg-meters. After tightening, check the torque again and then tighten further by approximately 90 degrees to 111 degrees. Before mounting the fuel injection pump on the engine, check that the key slot on the compressor's crankshaft points upward. Turn the flywheel so that the gauge line on it aligns with the pointer at the fuel injection timing indicated on the caution plate. Next, align the pointer on the injection pump with the gauge line on the auto timer. Install the fuel injection pump in this manner and tighten the cotter bolt with the specified torque while keeping the clearance between the driving coupling and the coupling plate less than 0.5 millimeters. Adjust valve clearance according to the instructions in the shop manual while the engine is cranked so that the gauge line on the flywheel comes directly under the pointer. Use a thickness gauge to check the clearance between the rocker arm and the valve cap. Tighten the lock nut with the specified torque to lock the adjusting screw after the clearance is adjusted. Check the clearance again after the lock nut is tightened. Attach the rocker cover. After replacing the nozzle tip gaskets and O-rings with new ones, fit the fuel injection nozzles on the engine. Tighten the nozzle installation bolts with the specified torque. Now install the water pump. Attach the oil filter and properly adjust the V-belt tension. Overly loose belts may cause engine overheating and short charging. Excessively tight belts may cause damage to the bearings and belts. When moving the alternator, due care must be taken not to damage the starter coil and the through bolt. Finally, to complete the assembly, attach the manifold, turbocharger, fan, and other remaining parts. As you have seen in this program, the inspection and maintenance work on engines must be performed strictly in line with the prescribed operation procedures. Those responsible for the maintenance work should view this program several times and become well acquainted with the sequence of maintenance work. In practical performance of this work, each job should be carried out while referring carefully to the descriptions in the shop manual.